Well, your father, Gabor Mate, he became a global phenomenon for a good reason. Yeah, for many good reasons.
Yeah.
And this latest book, The Myth of Normal, is just another one that kind of cemented the reputation of him. They call him the human whisperer.
Yes.
Which is kind of funny. But true at the same time. And this book, The Myth of Normal, is co-written with you.
Yeah, my name's on the title, on the cover.
So we're gonna jump into it, but before we start doing it, from the people who are not familiar with Gabor or with you, let's just give a little introduction about who he actually is and his story, which is also revealed here, and it's really not unknown.
Yeah.
But for many people who are just introducing this topic to them, maybe it's going to be probably of big importance in order to understand the big picture around the topic of trauma.
Yeah.
And then I would like to dedicate some time to talk about you and your career, because it's a very interesting mix of things that you actually do. And now you're a published author also. So yeah, where would be a good start with your father? Probably 1945, I guess.
44.
44. Well, 44 was when he was born.
Exactly. So, I mean, just keep in mind, I'll be telling this history as his son. So this is a biased telling, but you know, there are some facts of the matter. Yeah, he was born not very far from here. Budapest is 2 hours away?
It's 3-4 hours.
3-4 hours. Okay.
Yeah.
So he was born in January 44, which was not the ideal time to be born in this part of the world as a Jew.
Especially in Hungary.
In Hungary
at the time, yeah.
And the Germans were already, you know, I should know the history in more specific detail than I do, but I do know that the Germans were making their incursion into, you know, toward Budapest from the outside of the country towards the center, and the deportations were happening. So. I'm not sure exactly when it was, but sometime that year, my dad's grandparents were deported to Auschwitz. His father, my grandfather, Andor, and now there's a Star Wars show named after him, obviously, Andor. Do you know that show, Andor?
No.
Disney Star Wars has anyway.
That's
the lead character. Yeah,
the lead character,
Andor.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Andor was my grandfather was away in a forced labor camp with the Hungarian army, and I think a friend smuggled him in, like hiding the fact that he was Jewish. And it was a dangerous time. It was just a really dangerous time, and they were living under terrible, terrible conditions, and the Jews were forced to move into a very small area of the city, you know, the Budapest ghetto. And, you know, because my grandfather did get, I think, like a 2-week leave to come home and see his son, but after that he didn't. My dad didn't see him again for another year. And my grandmother, Judy, didn't have much news from him, or they didn't have news of each other, so they really didn't know if the other was alive or dead. So it was just an extremely stressful time. And my dad tells the story of how his mother called the pediatrician a few days after he was born, saying, "Can you come see us? Gabor won't stop crying." And the doctor said, "Of course I'll come, but I should tell you, all my Jewish babies are crying." You know, and the point that my dad makes there is, you know, well, what do Jewish babies know of Nazis and genocides and world wars? They don't. What they feel is the stress of their parents, the emotional absence of their parents, which has nothing to do with a lack of love, anything but. It has to do with just people having limits, you know, and the emotional realities that people live in is what gets transmitted to the child, not the conscious intentions of the parents. And, you know, my grandmother was a hero, and she kept him alive by heroic means. At one point, they managed to find refuge in I think it was a Swiss-operated maybe I'm getting this confused with Schindler's List. I find myself more vague on the details than I really ought to be. But it was a converted glass factory, but just overrun with families. Latrines in the court, no bathrooms, just very unsanitary. My dad had dysentery, almost died. And at a certain point, not on a whim, but on a strong gut feeling, my grandmother, on the spur of the moment, I would say, handed him, I think he was maybe 8 or 9 months at this point, handed him to a non-Jewish woman on the street and begged her, please take my baby to these relatives who happened to be living in relatively safer circumstances. And because she had no faith that she herself was going to survive, and she knew that he wouldn't. And this woman, talk about another hero, conveyed him safely to these relatives. And I think it was 6 weeks apart. Maybe it was fewer. I don't know. You have to go back and read the book. Again, I'm forgetting the details. But, it was severe separation from his mother to save his life. So these were the circumstances of his birth. And meanwhile, my grandmother got word that her parents had been exterminated in Auschwitz. Her sister had been, my great aunt Marta had been deported to Auschwitz with them, but she actually survived. But they didn't know that until afterwards, when she came home in a Nazi guard uniform, because that's the only clothes she could find after the camps were liberated. So just a very dramatic, horrific, adverse, stressful way to come into the world.
Yeah.
And that was his introduction to planet Earth.
Yeah, and the human race and the society.
And the human race and the society and the realities of being a person, yeah.
Yeah, and already experiencing the first detachment.
Yes.
Yeah, which is going to be very important in understanding, because what I love about this book is because it's intertwined with a lot of personal stories and a lot of testimonials, and which gives it a more of a dramatic touch, which it gives it sort of a novelic type of feeling. It's not just a narrow specific book designed for people within the who has some kind of expertise or knowledge.
Yeah, certainly not
within the area of expertise, right? So, how he ended up in Canada?
Well, the war ended in 1945, and his parents reunited. Very happy to be alive. They had another son, my uncle János, a couple of years later, born into relatively happy circumstances, and he had a childhood growing up in Budapest. But then, first the Nazis, then the Soviets.
Yeah.
1956, the revolution. He wakes up to the sound of tank thunder of the Red Army coming in to crush the student uprising. And I think basically it was like my grandparents looked at each other and was like, nope.
We're not having this again.
Not again. We're getting out of here. And they trudged out of there, late one night in the rain through the mud into Austria. And there's many stories, in a lot of Hungarian refugees from 1956 in Canada and the United States who all left in the same way around the same time. It's interesting. I keep meeting a lot of, children of that Hungarian story. And I think the options were between New York, Montreal, and Vancouver or something like that. And they ended up on they landed at Halifax. They took a boat and got on a cross-Canada train and didn't get off until it hit the Pacific Ocean, and they ended up in Vancouver. And then they had another son in Vancouver, my Uncle George, who goes by Mate, because he's the Canadian-born Mate,
Mate.
Yeah. Of course, when I was growing up, my dad was Gabor Mate. That's how Vancouverites, that's how Canadians said it,
Yeah.
So yeah, that's, and then he met my mother in the late 60s at the University of British Columbia, where she was a cartoonist and he was a political columnist, and she was assigned to draw his caricature.
Yeah, during the Yugoslavia, we had Yugoslavian time. You know, the former republics. We all used to be one country called Yugoslavia.
Yeah,
especially at the time.
I remember. I was born in '75. I remember this.
Yeah, so yeah, and during the Iron Curtain and during the Soviet era and stuff like that, so we had a lot of refugees from Hungary, and we were helping a lot of them to cross over.
Yeah.
At the time, because Yugoslavia and the President Tito at the time, they were like in this very specific political situation where they could afford it. We were behind the curtain, sort of saying it, because if, how they like to say it, if communism was red, Yugoslavian communism was kind of pink. So he was a dictator, but benevolent one.
Yes.
But still a dictator, right? And he held his power also by various means. One of the means was this non-alignment agreement that he had with, Middle Eastern and African countries.
Yeah,
that's basically my origin story, because my father came, to study during the Yugoslavia in the '60s, and he was the member of, Flower Power 1968 generation, the worldwide. Quite opposite of the culture he's coming from. So Gabor basically dedicated his whole life dealing with trauma in a way, and discovering the topic and the influence of trauma in his life many years later, right? But in his professional career, he was, dealing with patients from various groups, from palliative care to, nurseries. Mm-hmm. So he was dealing with children. He was dealing with people at the end of their life.
Yep.
And over the course of many years during his practice, he noticed commonalities, right?
Yes.
Yeah, something that binds them all together.
Yeah.
Which is the thing that you emphasize so much, called trauma. Mm-hmm. And before we go into trauma and the myth of normal and why the book is called that, let's dive in. The myth of normal. Two things that we have to dissect first, and not dissect, more of a not decompose, but more deconstruct. Deconstruct is the word I'm looking for. Yeah, the thing that we have to deconstruct. I
like decompose though. I like that image.
Yeah, deconstruct is what is normal. Mm-hmm. How do we perceive normal, and how do we deconstruct it in order to understand what this book is about?
Well, that's the joke, isn't it? Because normal is what we don't perceive.
Yeah.
I mean, there are legitimate uses of the word normal, as we say in the introduction. If you're a doctor and you're trying to make sure a person's going to stay alive, you want to make sure that their blood temperature stays within normal range. If you're a doctor with a pregnant patient who's saying, hey, I'm having this complication, you say, oh, that's normal for your trimester, right? Yeah. So those are valid, basically just statistical.
But we can also call them typical, maybe.
You could say typical,
yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But the normal is the word that is used in medical practice. But when we talk about normal in the sense of the myth of normal, it's that to which we have become accustomed that isn't necessarily natural or healthy. But the nature of that is, you said, what do we perceive as normal? It's what we don't perceive. We tell the story, or we recount this beautiful little allegory that David Foster Wallace gave at a commencement speech about two fish who were swimming along one day, two young fish swimming along, having a nice time. And they pass by an older fish, and the older fish says, good morning, boys, how's the water? And they keep swimming along, and they turn to each other, and one of them turns to the other, but a few minutes later says, what the fuck is water? Because they don't need to notice it, because they can just take it for granted. Well, so what is the water that we swim in that we don't even notice? And we're trying to draw people's attention to things that they're not even perceiving. So for instance, first of all, you have to. It starts with noticing it, and one of the ways you notice it, just like you were saying before, like creating that bridge from I don't even know how I feel. Well, one thing is to just take a look around and say, how's that going for you? So in a personal life, you say, well, how's that not knowing how you feel going for you? Well, I'm kind of depressed, and I don't really know what I'm doing in my life. I'm kind of bored, and I'm, smoking a lot of pot, and watching a lot of bad TV. Well, because that's how that's going for you. That's a clue as to something.
Yeah,
that's not the secret chord that David played and it pleased the Lord. On the societal level, how's normal going for us? Well, we got skyrocketing cancer rates, autoimmune rates. Suicidality is going way up, especially after all the COVID lockdowns. Mental health diagnoses going off the charts. Just unprecedented spikes in chronic health issues in the most wealthy nations in the world during the most the very first line of the book, which I will take personal credit for having written this sentence. In the most health-obsessed society in human history, all is not well.
Mm. Yeah.
How can that be? Well, something is off, right? So there's something about what we've become accustomed to, or acculturated to, we might say, given that it's a question of culture, that isn't doing us any favors on the health level. But because our ideology says, no, this is how it's supposed to be, then we're left to cope with that. So then what becomes normal is, well, okay, now we're going to fight cancer. We're going to do marathons for cancer and marathons for multiple sclerosis. I'm not trying to denigrate those things. But we act as if they're sort of antagonistic intruders who have landed from outer space, who are messing up our nice normal. And we just need to, kill the aliens or solve the mystery, and we can go back to being normal. But what if these diseases, or at least their prevalence, their flourishing, their metastasizing, you might say on us, are an expression of how we live, not an interruption of how we live, both on the collective and the individual level. So there's all kinds of evidence in the book, and now I'm jumping a little bit ahead, that, and my dad's been cataloging this science, which is not his own original research, but he's been synthesizing it ever since his book, When the Body Says No, 20 years ago, that much of chronic illness is an expression of, or it's potentiated by, or it predisposes people to, it's predisposed by certain fixed, normalized personality traits that are expressions of people being cut off from themselves, which itself is an expression of trauma. So people who suppress their anger.
Yeah.
People who can't say no. People who have to rigidly identify with their role and always do their duty and never express themselves on that never take the leap of faith bridge,
Yeah.
There are physical consequences or there are emotional and psychological consequences. And of course, here's another thing that gets normalized. The Western medical ideology, really a superstition that mind and body are separate. They ain't.
Yeah.
They can't be separated. They're the same. They're not even connected, because the same thing can't be connected to itself. It's just two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
So all of these things, I'm starting to like shade in that picture that you're asking about of what is normal. There's so many things that have become normalized that are, we can work our way backwards from how it's going to say, well, why is it that way? And maybe there's a simpler reason why our health is going the way it's going than that we have to solve this pandemic and this disease and this mental health crisis and this separate cancer of this body part. Maybe it's all connected.
Yeah, sort of a holistic, approach to things. I just want to
holistic approach, but also a good detective approach too. I mean, Sherlock Holmes would always want to have the simplest, most elegant explanation.
Yeah. And how it doesn't matter how improbable, if it's the only one. The left.
It only seems improbable because we're looking at it in a way that we've become used to.
This Eric from the Sane Society quote is perfect for the book. So I just want to read it. I don't want to paraphrase it, right? The fact that millions of people share the same vices does not make these vices virtues. Mm-hmm. The fact that they share so many errors does not make the errors to be truths. And the fact that millions of people share the same forms of mental pathology does not make these people sane. It's so nice. It's so well put.
Yeah.
It's all well put. And also the myth of normal, trauma, illness, and healing in a toxic culture.
Yeah.
So there's another thing that we have to put in the mix.
Yes.
It's a toxic culture.
Yes.
And regarding the fact that the one of the most surprising. What I love about the book also is it doesn't shy away from its sources.
No.
It's sort of you can use it also as an aggregate of various different authors and people who had a lot of experience in practice. All of them put together in a very well.
The book is a conference. It's a clearing. It's like my dad. I mean, I think he interviewed 250 people. He gathered 25,000 articles. It's a crazy amount of research.
How big was the research actually?
10 years, I think literally 25,000 articles.
That's a lot.
You
had to go through all of them?
I didn't. No, I came aboard relatively late in the process, with 4 years to go. My job was to make sure the damn thing got written.
Yeah.
And that it was readable.
Yeah,
that's
no easy feat.
No, not with this much material. I mean, my dad's a good writer, but we wanted this book to have a little bit of a bit more. I mean, we wanted this to be for the broadest possible audience, both geographically and culturally speaking. No matter what your politics are, no matter what your education level is, and I tried to bring in just a bit more lightness, a bit more of a contemporary feel, things like that. But the work, the research, incredible amount of work went into this on his part.
One of the most, one of the hardest one to take for me of all those, from all those, I lost the word, examples, right? Was the connection between agreeable people and ALS. It's like, once I've read that, I was like, that's not possible.
Well, especially given the study that we cited where nurses basically were asked to predict based on just meeting patients or reading their personality profiles which of them would get ALS or which would test positive for it. And their success rate was something like 85%. And they would say, this person can't have ALS, they're not nice enough. And when we say nice, we don't mean kind, we don't mean benevolent or good-hearted. We mean excessively, to a self-abnegating degree, always putting other people's needs first, suppressing one's own suppressing one's own anger, that kind of compulsive niceness that you can just feel with somebody, which has a kind of tension underneath it. Why is there a tension? Because they're stuffing down their own feelings, and they don't, and that's the thing, on the individual level, they've completely normalized it for themselves.
Yeah.
So they don't even know they're doing it, and there's a reason for that, because those coping patterns come from childhood as a way to survive traumatizing situations. If we gather from our childhood environment that if I'm angry, mommy and daddy won't be okay, or they won't love me, or I won't get the love I need. Well, it's not enough for me to say, well, okay, maybe just consciously hide it from them every time they're around. No, much, much better if my brain says, okay, let's forget how to be angry.
Yeah.
Let's stuff it away. Let's normalize being nice and just always being agreeable. And if you think about it for 1 second, my dad always makes this analogy, and I think it's pretty self-evident. The immune system and the anger system, the emotional system, have exactly the same purpose, which is to welcome in good stuff and keep out the bad stuff.
Yeah.
But if you teach, if you enforce on your emotional system, don't be angry, it means that you never get to say no, which means you have no say over what's coming in and what's going out. And since these systems are not only connected, but in fact unitary, you're messing with the immune system. And what is autoimmune disease? Literally, it's the immune system attacking itself, getting confused about what's good for it, what's bad for it. So yeah, it's crazy. Not crazy in the sense of insane, but it seems outlandish when you first read about it. But that's just one data point among so many that we try to bring in to show that all these things are connected. And of course, Western medicine doesn't want to see those connections.